A mistress finds her husband's slave hiding a love letter in the walls of their home, and she's certain it's from another enslaved person, a desperate romance between two people with nothing to their names. But when she unfolds that letter with trembling hands and reads the first line, everything she believed about her marriage, her household, and the man sleeping beside her shatters into pieces, because it wasn't from another slave at all. It was written by someone she knows, someone who walks through her own home, someone whose identity will force her to choose between the comfortable lie she's been living and a truth so devastating it will cost her everything. The letter was found on a Tuesday. Margaret had been inspecting the East Wing, the servants' quarters, though she rarely ventured there anymore. The plasterer was supposed to have finished repairs weeks ago, but the man was lazy, incompetent, the sort of worker her husband hired without consulting her. She'd decided to check his progress herself, armed with a critical eye and a growing list of complaints that she fully intended to present at dinner. The afternoon light filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the bare stone walls. The air smelled of damp plaster, sawdust, and something else, something vaguely human that made her wrinkle her nose. She'd always found these quarters distasteful, despite their necessity. The less she had to think about where the enslaved people slept, the easier it was to maintain her carefully constructed world view. That's when she saw it. A corner of yellowed paper protruding from between two stones in the wall, near the hearth where the enslaved man slept. Her heart had quickened, not from curiosity at first, but from indignation. How dare he hide things in my home? What secrets could possibly matter to someone in his position? She'd pulled it free easily. The mortar was crumbling, another failure she'd need to address with the contractor. The envelope was unsealed, the paper inside folded twice with obvious care. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, though she told herself it was merely the chill of the unheated room, not anticipation or dread. The handwriting was elegant, educated, completely unexpected. Not the crude scratching of someone barely literate, not the desperate scrawl of a love-sick fool. This was the penmanship of someone who had been taught to write properly, someone who understood the mechanics of language and chose each word with deliberation. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. She unfolded the letter fully, her eyes landing on the salutation. My dearest. Those two words changed everything. Her hands shook as she read further, the implications spreading through her mind like poison through water. The letter spoke of longing, of stolen moments, of a love that defied the very structure of their world. It spoke of hope in a place where hope had no business existing, and it was addressed to someone. But who? Margaret sank onto a wooden bench nearby, the letter hanging limply from her fingers. Around her, the sounds of the household continued. Distant voices, the creak of floorboards above, the ordinary rhythms of a life that suddenly felt fragile and false. She looked around the sparse room with new eyes, seeing it not as a servant's quarters but as a place where secrets lived in the cracks between stones. Someone in this house had written these words. Someone she knew. Someone who sat at her table, walked her halls, perhaps even smiled to her face while harboring this dangerous passion. The question wasn't whether the letter was from another enslaved person, though that had been her first, almost relieved assumption. The question was far more terrifying. Who had the education, the audacity, and the access to write such a letter? And, more importantly, what was her husband's connection to all of this? Margaret didn't show the letter to anyone that day. She'd folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her dress, feeling its weight against her ribs like a second heartbeat, a secret that pulsed with its own terrible life. All through dinner, she watched her husband, Thomas, across the table, searching his face for signs of guilt, for cracks in the facade of normalcy he wore so effortlessly, like a well-tailored coat that never wrinkled. He ate his soup without comment, the spoon moving mechanically from bowl to mouth in the same practiced rhythm she'd observed for 15 years of marriage. He discussed the weather with the same bland pleasantness he always did, remarking on the likelihood of rain and the impact it would have on the autumn harvest. He made a joke about the new horse he'd purchased last week, a temperamental Arabian mare that had already thrown 2 grooms, laughing at his own wit in that infuriating way of his, the one that made his colleagues at the club chuckle politely while Margaret bit the inside of her cheek. Nothing in his demeanor suggested he knew anything about a hidden letter, about a forbidden romance brewing beneath his own roof like a fire smoldering in the walls, waiting to consume everything. But then again, Thomas was exceptionally good at pretending. It was one of the things she'd admired about him when they were younger, his ability to navigate social situations with ease, to say exactly what people wanted to hear, to present himself as exactly what the world expected him to be. She'd thought it was charm. Now, watching him butter his bread with meticulous care, she wondered if it had always been something else entirely. After dinner, Margaret retreated to her private sitting room, the one place in the house where she could think without interruption, where the servants knew not to disturb her without explicit invitation. It was her sanctuary, decorated in soft blues and grays, lined with books she actually read and needlework projects she'd abandoned years ago. She locked the door behind her, a precaution that felt both excessive and necessary. She withdrew the letter from her pocket and read it again, this time more slowly, parsing every word for hidden meaning, analyzing the construction of each sentence like a scholar studying an ancient text. My dearest, how I long for the day when we need not steal these moments in shadow, when the world might know what burns between us. I know it is impossible. I know the cost of such a dream. But when I see you, when I hear your voice, I cannot help but believe that some things are worth any price. Last night, when you came to the garden, I thought my heart might burst from my chest. For those few stolen minutes, I was not what the world has made me. I was simply yours, and you were mine, and nothing else mattered. Your hands on my face, your breath against my neck, the way you whispered my name as if it were sacred. Forgive me for my weakness. Forgive me for wanting more than I deserve. But know this: you have changed me irrevocably. You have shown me that there is more to existence than the narrow confines I was born into. You have shown me that love is possible, even in a world designed to deny it to people like me. I will wait for you in the usual place. Come if you can, even if you cannot know that I am always waiting. Forever yours, E. Margaret read the signature 3 times, her eyes lingering on that single letter as if it might suddenly transform into a full name. E. Just one letter. A precaution, certainly, but also an intimacy, as if the writer assumed the recipient would know immediately who they were, as if there were no ambiguity, no possibility of confusion. She rose from her chair and began to pace, her fingers trailing along the spines of books she'd read 100 times. Her mind worked through the household systematically, cataloging faces and names, trying to match them to the elegant handwriting of the letter. Who among their staff had the education to write like this? Who had access to paper, to pen, to the kind of privacy required for such correspondence? The possibilities were limited, which made the truth all the more terrifying. Not the kitchen staff. Most of them were illiterate, able perhaps to recognize their own names, but little more. Not the groundskeepers, rough men hired for their strength rather than their intellect. Not the scullery maids, girls barely out of childhood, working 16-hour days in the kitchens. Not the stable hands or the footmen, or the dozens of other servants who moved through the house like ghosts, present but unseen. But there were others. The governess had left 3 years ago, a stern woman who'd taught Margaret's younger cousin before the family moved away. The secretary who handled Thomas's business correspondence. But no, he was a free man, hired help, not enslaved. He lived in town and came only 3 days a week. Then it struck her with the force of a physical blow. The library. Thomas had recently hired a new assistant to catalog his collection, a project he'd been discussing for months. A young man with an unusual background, Thomas had said, though he'd been characteristically vague about the details. Margaret had barely paid attention at the time. She'd been preoccupied with the renovations to the parlor, with the endless decisions about paint colors and wallpaper patterns and the placement of furniture. She'd nodded absently when Thomas mentioned it, filed the information away in the part of her mind reserved for household management. But now, the memory surfaced with crystalline clarity, every detail suddenly vivid and significant. Could it be? The library assistant. Educated, Thomas had said. Quiet. Hard-working. Margaret had seen him only once or twice in passing. A young man with dark hair and careful movements, the kind of person who seemed to take up less space than others, as if he'd learned to make himself small. And if so, if this Elias was the one who'd written the letter, then who was he writing to? Margaret's stomach twisted with the sickening realization that spread through her like poison through water. She moved to her writing desk and pulled out a small leather journal she kept there, one in which she'd recorded the household staff and their duties in her neat, precise handwriting. Her eyes scanned the list methodically, searching for confirmation of what she already suspected. There, written in her own hand, dated 6 months prior, Elias, library assistant, hired by T, educated background, cataloging collection. She closed her eyes, trying to remember his face more clearly. Young, she thought. Perhaps 30, perhaps younger. It was difficult to say. Dark hair, yes. Careful eyes that seemed to look at nothing and everything simultaneously. Quiet. She'd barely spoken to him. Most of the household staff were invisible to her. She gave them orders through the housekeeper, and they appeared or disappeared as needed, like pieces on a chessboard being moved by an unseen hand. But Thomas would have spoken to him. Thomas spent hours in the library ostensibly reading and cataloging, though Margaret had begun to wonder what he actually did in there. The implications began to crystallize, each one more damning than the last. Margaret sank back into her chair, the letter trembling in her hands. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. She wasn't sure which possibility terrified her more, that her husband was conducting an affair with a man, something unspeakable, something that could destroy him utterly if it became known, or that he was conducting it with someone enslaved in his own home, someone with no legal right to refuse him, someone whose very existence was defined by his ownership. Either way, everything she believed about her marriage was a lie. The comfortable fiction she'd constructed over 15 years of marriage, of a respectable man, a respectable union, a respectable life, was crumbling like the mortar in the servants' quarters. Margaret looked at the letter again, at the words, "Forever yours," and felt something break inside her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something more fundamental. A crack in the foundation of her world. She needed to know more. She needed to understand exactly what was happening in her own home, in the library where her husband spent his evenings, in the garden where stolen moments occurred under cover of darkness. And she needed to know whether Thomas loved this man, or whether this was simply another form of power, another way to take what belonged to him by right of ownership. The distinction, she realized, might matter more than she wanted to admit. The library was dark when Margaret entered it the following morning. She'd waited until Thomas left for his club, a Tuesday ritual he observed without fail, one that gave her a window of approximately 3 hours. The servants were occupied with their tasks, the house settling into its midday rhythms. No one would think it unusual for the mistress to visit the library. She visited it regularly, or at least she had years ago before the collection had grown too large, and Thomas had begun to treat it as his personal domain, a sanctuary where he could retreat from the demands of married life and polite society. She carried a candle, though the October sunlight filtered through the tall windows in pale, insufficient streams. The room smelled of leather and paper, of dust and something else, something faintly sweet that she couldn't quite identify. Beeswax, perhaps. Or cologne. The thought made her throat tighten uncomfortably, and she found herself holding her breath as if the very air had become suspect. The books were arranged in careful rows, organized by subject and size according to some system that Thomas had explained to her once during their early years of marriage and that she'd promptly forgotten. She'd never been particularly interested in his bibliophilia, had always found his obsession with cataloging and organizing somewhat tedious. Now she wondered if that disinterest had been deliberate on her part, a convenient excuse to avoid spending time in this room, to avoid seeing what was happening here. She moved past the shelves slowly, her eyes searching for something she couldn't quite name. Evidence. Confirmation. Anything that would transform this vague suspicion into concrete fact. Something undeniable that she could hold in her hands and examine from every angle. It was on the third shelf, behind a row of philosophy texts, Descartes and Locke and Hume, the very books that Thomas claimed had shaped his thinking, that she found it. A small journal, bound in worn leather that had been softened by frequent handling, with pages that had been filled with handwriting she recognized from the letter hidden in her pocket. She knew she shouldn't open it, knew that reading it would constitute a violation of privacy that even her current desperation couldn't quite justify. Knew that ignorance might be preferable to the knowledge she was about to gain. But her hands were already moving, already trembling as they opened to the first page, and she found herself unable to stop. October 15th. I have been here for 6 months now, and sometimes I still cannot believe it is real, that I am real, that any of this is real. There are moments when I wake in the servants' quarters and think I must have dreamed it all. The library, the books, him. When Mr. Thomas first hired me, I thought it was a mistake. I thought surely he would discover what I was. Not just an enslaved man, but an educated one, a thinking one. A man with thoughts and feelings and desires that have no place in this world. A man who reads philosophy and poetry and dreams of freedom. But he didn't send me away. He didn't report me to the authorities or have me whipped for the crime of literacy. He brought me to the library and showed me the books, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not as property, not as a tool to be used, not as something less than human, but as a person, as someone whose mind mattered, as someone whose thoughts and feelings had value. I should not write these things. I should not even think them. But the words come anyway, spilling out like blood from a wound, and I cannot stop them. Writing is the only freedom I have. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the pages, each one more intimate than the last. Each entry was dated with meticulous care, a careful chronicle of a life she'd known nothing about, happening in her own home, in the rooms she walked through every day without seeing. October 22nd. He came to the library today. He does most days now, though he pretends it is to check on my progress with the cataloging. We both know the truth. We both feel it, hanging in the air between us like humidity before a storm. He stands very close to me when he points out which books need to be moved, which sections reorganized. His hand brushes against mine when he hands me a volume, and I pretend it is accidental, though we both know it is not. These small touches are both everything and nothing. They are the only physical connection I am permitted, and yet they are also torture, a constant reminder of what we can never have. I am terrified, not of discovery, though that terror is there, constant and gnawing like a rat in the walls, but of what I feel, of what grows between us with each passing day. It is dangerous, it is impossible. It is the only real thing I have ever known. Sometimes I think about running, about disappearing into the night and never looking back. But I cannot. Not anymore. Not since he looked at me the way he did last week, with such longing, such recognition of my humanity, that I felt something inside me break open. Margaret sank into a nearby chair, the journal falling open in her lap. Her eyes flew across the pages. Unable to stop reading, unable to look away from this intimate chronicle of a love that should not exist, could not exist in the world they inhabited. November 3rd. Last night in the garden. The moon was nearly full, and I was certain we would be discovered at any moment. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the call of a night bird, the distant bark of a dog, seemed like the approach of discovery. My heart was in my throat the entire time, but he was so gentle, so careful with me, as if I were made of glass and might shatter at the slightest pressure. He whispered things to me, promises that cannot be kept, dreams that cannot be realized. I know they are impossible, but I let myself believe them anyway, just for those few stolen minutes beneath the stars. He said my name. Just my name, over and over as if it were a prayer. As if saying it could make it true, could make me real, could make this moment real, could make what we feel for each other real in a way that the rest of the world denies. Afterward, lying in the grass with his arm around me, I felt something I have never felt before. Not just pleasure, though there was that, a physical sensation so intense it bordered on pain, but a sense of wholeness, of being complete, of being human in a way that the world has always denied me. I would give anything to feel that way again. I would give everything. The pages continued, each one a small window into a world Margaret had never suspected existed, a parallel universe operating in the shadows of her own home. Elias wrote about his life before, about being born enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, about learning to read in secret from the plantation owner's grandson, about the books he'd discovered that had shown him there was more to existence than servitude and degradation. He wrote about the moment Thomas had hired him, about the shock of being treated with something approaching dignity. He wrote about the first time their hands had touched, about the electricity of that contact, about the way his entire world had shifted on its axis. He wrote about Thomas with a tenderness that made Margaret's chest ache with a complicated mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. Love, certainly, but also something else, a kind of desperate hope, a belief that love could somehow transcend the brutal architecture of the world they lived in. But there were darker entries, too. Entries written in a different hand, she realized with a start that made her drop the journal. Entries in Thomas's own handwriting, tucked between Elias's pages as if they belonged there, as if this journal was a shared space, a conversation between two people who could not speak openly. My dearest, I cannot stop thinking about you, about what we did in the garden, about what I want to do again and again for the rest of my life. I know it is madness. I know the risk, but I no longer care about the risk. You have become necessary to me in a way that nothing else has ever been. Margaret means nothing to me. I realize I should not write that, should not even think it, but it is true. Our marriage is a hollow thing, a performance we put on for society. She is a dutiful wife, a competent mistress of the household, but she is not you. She has never looked at me the way you do. She has never made me feel like I matter, like my thoughts and feelings have value. You have changed me, Elias. You have shown me what it means to truly live, to truly feel, to truly connect with another human being. I have been thinking about what you said, about freedom, about running away together. I know it is impossible. I know the consequences would be catastrophic, but I cannot stop imagining it. A life where we could be together openly, where I didn't have to hide what you mean to me, where we could walk through the world without fear, without shame, without the constant terror of discovery. Forgive me for my weakness. Forgive me for asking you to bear this burden with me. But know that you have changed everything. You have changed me. Margaret's vision blurred as she read. This was not what she'd expected. She'd prepared herself for the discovery of an affair, for infidelity, for betrayal, for all the standard humiliations that came with being a wronged wife. She'd imagined finding evidence of a dalliance with a woman from his club, perhaps, or a widow he'd been visiting in town. Something that, while painful, at least fit within the normal parameters of marital transgression. But this was something else entirely. This was love. Real, desperate, impossible love. Love that transcended the boundaries of gender and class and legality. Love that was not just forbidden but unspeakable. Something so far outside the boundaries of acceptable society that even to acknowledge it could bring ruin. And it was destroying her marriage in a way that simple infidelity never could. Because infidelity was about desire, about weakness, about a moment of passion that could theoretically be forgiven. But this was about the very core of who Thomas was. This was about him choosing someone else, choosing a life with someone else, over everything he'd built, everything he'd been born to. She heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly closed the journal, her hands fumbling with the leather cover. She slid it back behind the philosophy texts with shaking hands, trying to arrange the books exactly as she'd found them, terrified that any disturbance would reveal her intrusion. Her heart pounded as the footsteps passed, as they faded away toward the back of the house. She sat very still in the chair, barely breathing, waiting for her pulse to slow, waiting for the panic to subside. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing inward, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. When she was certain she was alone again, when she'd waited long enough that she was sure the servant had moved on to other tasks, she withdrew the journal once more and turned to a page near the end, one dated just 3 days ago. The handwriting was Thomas's, urgent and passionate. Elias, we cannot continue like this. I have been thinking about it constantly, and I believe I have found a solution. It will require courage from both of us, and it will require that you trust me completely. But I believe it is possible. I believe we could be free. I have made arrangements, I have contacts, men who help people in our situation, who understand that some bonds of love transcend the bonds of law and society. It will not be easy. It will require that we abandon everything, our home, our position, our very identities. But I am ready. I am ready to give it all up for you. Meet me in the library tonight after everyone has retired. I have something to show you, something that will change everything. Margaret closed the journal with trembling hands. The words seemed to echo in her mind, each one a hammer blow. I have found a solution. It will require courage from both of us. We could be free. What solution? What could possibly exist in a world where two men, one free, one enslaved, could never openly acknowledge what they felt for each other? What was Thomas planning? Was he talking about helping Elias escape, about running away together, about abandoning his entire life? And, more importantly, what was she going to do about it? She looked around the library at the carefully organized books, at the evidence of a life she'd never truly known. The room suddenly felt foreign to her, like a place she'd never been before. How many times had she walked past this door without truly seeing it? How many conversations had Thomas had in here that she knew nothing about? How much of her marriage had been a lie? Somewhere in this house, her husband was planning something with an enslaved man. Something that would change everything. Something that would destroy not just their marriage, but potentially everything they'd built, everything their family represented. The question was whether she would stop him or help him. And underneath that question was another, more troubling one. Did she even want to stop him? Or was there a part of her, a part she barely dared to acknowledge, that envied him? That envied the clarity of his feeling, the certainty of his love, the willingness to sacrifice everything for what he believed in. She placed the journal back behind the books and stood on shaking legs. The candle she'd brought was burning low, the wax pooling around the wick. She picked it up and moved toward the door, her mind spinning with possibilities and implications. Tonight, Thomas would meet with Elias. Tonight, whatever plan he'd been developing would be revealed, and Margaret would have to decide what she would do with the knowledge she now possessed. The weight of that decision pressed down on her like a physical force as she left the library and closed the door quietly behind her. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay in bed beside Thomas, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, trying to discern whether it was the steady respiration of genuine sleep or the calculated mimicry of a man pretending to be unconscious. The darkness pressed down on her like a physical weight, suffocating and absolute, and every sound in the house seemed magnified, the creak of floorboards settling, the whisper of wind against the window panes, the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall marking time with its relentless precision. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Part of her wanted to confront Thomas immediately, to demand answers, to rage at him for the deception and betrayal. But another part, a quieter, more dangerous part, wanted to understand, wanted to know exactly what he was planning, exactly how far he was willing to go, exactly what this meant for all of them. The journal pages kept replaying in her mind, each word burning itself into her consciousness. We could be free. I have found a solution. I'm willing to give up everything. At midnight, she heard him rise. He moved with careful deliberation, easing himself out of bed without disturbing the mattress, his movements slow and practiced, as if he'd done this many times before. Margaret kept her eyes closed, kept her breathing even and measured, though her heart was hammering so violently she was certain he must hear it. The sound of her own pulse seemed to fill the entire room, a thunderous drumbeat that surely must give away her wakefulness. She heard him pull on his dressing gown, the dark blue one he favored, the one with the silk lining that whispered softly when he moved. She heard the soft rustle of fabric as he tied the sash around his waist, heard the nearly imperceptible sound of his feet on the wooden floor as he moved toward the door. Then he was gone, slipping out of the room like a ghost, like a man who'd become expert at disappearing, leaving her alone in the darkness with nothing but her racing thoughts and her trembling hands. She waited exactly 5 minutes, counting the seconds in her head with meticulous precision, a discipline she'd learned years ago when she was a girl, and her governess had taught her to meditate through difficult moments. Count slowly, Margaret. Count until your heart slows. Count until you are calm. She'd never imagined she'd need this skill for something like this. Then she rose as well, moving carefully in the darkness, pulling on her own dressing gown with shaking hands. The fabric felt strange against her skin, foreign somehow, as if she'd become a different person in the hours since she'd discovered the journal. She lit a candle from the embers that still glowed in the fireplace, watching the flame catch and grow, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the bedroom she'd shared with Thomas for 15 years. The hallway was silent and empty, a corridor of shadows and closed doors. The servants would be asleep in their quarters by now, the house belonging entirely to the family. She moved carefully, avoiding the boards she knew would creak, knowledge accumulated over years of midnight visits to the kitchen or the parlor when sleep eluded her. She kept to the edges of the corridors where the shadows were deepest, where the candlelight would be less visible to anyone who might happen to emerge from their room. The library was on the ground floor, at the far end of the east wing. It took her nearly 10 minutes to reach it, moving slowly and carefully through the darkened house, descending the main staircase with one hand trailing along the banister. When she arrived at the door, she found it slightly ajar, a thin line of candlelight visible beneath the frame, spilling out into the hallway like liquid gold. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her own candle extinguished, and listened. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." Thomas's voice came through the gap, soft and anxious, tinged with a desperation she'd never heard before. "I thought perhaps you'd changed your mind, that you'd decided this was too dangerous." "I told you I would," Elias replied, and his voice was deeper than Margaret had expected, resonant with an education that belied his status as enslaved property. His voice carried the careful diction of someone who'd educated himself, who'd absorbed knowledge through reading and observation and the kind of intellectual hunger that no amount of servitude could extinguish. "I'm always here when you ask me to be. You know that." There was a sound, the rustling of papers perhaps, or the movement of bodies drawing closer. Margaret held her breath, pressing herself further against the wall, making herself as small as possible. "I have something to show you," Thomas said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Something I've been preparing for weeks. I wanted to wait until I was absolutely certain, until I'd thought through every possible consequence and contingency. But I can't wait any longer. I need you to know that I'm serious about this, that I'm willing to do whatever it takes, that this isn't just a fantasy or a dream I indulge in during our stolen moments together." "Show me," Elias said, and there was both hope and fear in those two words. Margaret heard the sound of a drawer being opened, heard the crinkle of documents being removed, the rustle of papers being handled with great care. She risked a glance through the gap in the door, positioning herself so she could see without being seen, her eye pressed against the narrow opening. Thomas stood near his desk, holding what appeared to be several papers, perhaps 5 or 6. She couldn't quite tell from this angle. Elias stood opposite him, his body tense with anticipation, his face illuminated by candlelight in a way that made him look almost ethereal, almost unreal. He was younger than Margaret had realized when she'd glimpsed him in passing around the house, perhaps 25 or 26, with intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him and a face that held a quiet dignity despite the circumstances of his life, despite the legal status that defined him as less than human. "These are forged documents," Thomas said, holding up the papers with a mixture of pride and fear. "They declare you a free man. They're well done. I paid a considerable sum to have them created by someone who knows the trade intimately, someone who's been doing this work for years. The signatures are authentic looking. The seals are perfect. With these, you could travel anywhere. You could go north, to Philadelphia or Boston, or even further. You could live openly as a free man." Elias reached out and took the papers with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the text, his lips moving slightly as he read. "Thomas, this is dangerous. If anyone discovers you had these made, if anyone traces them back to you—" "I know the risk," Thomas said, and his voice was steady now, resolved. "I've thought about nothing else for weeks. I've gone through every possible scenario, every potential disaster. I've calculated the odds of discovery, the consequences if we're caught, and I've decided that the risk is worth it. I can't keep living like this, Elias. I can't keep pretending that my marriage means anything to me when it doesn't. I can't keep hiding what I feel for you, compartmentalizing my life into acceptable and unacceptable parts." "What are you saying?" Elias's voice was barely a whisper, as if he was afraid that speaking the words aloud might break whatever spell had been cast. "What are you really saying, Thomas?" "I'm saying I want to leave," Thomas said, and the words seemed to fall into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in all directions. "I'm saying I want to take these documents and disappear with you. I have money saved. Money I've been setting aside for years, money that Margaret doesn't know about. Enough to support us for years if we're careful, if we live modestly. We could go to Philadelphia or Boston or even further north. We could go to Canada if we wanted to, somewhere that the long arm of the law can't reach us. We could start over. We could be together openly, without fear, without shame." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly around her. She gripped the doorframe for support, her fingernails digging into the wood, afraid that if she let go she might fall, might collapse, might shatter into 1,000 pieces right there on the floor. "You would give up everything?" Elias asked, and there was something in his voice, a kind of desperate hope mixed with disbelief, a longing so profound it was almost painful to hear. "Your home? Your position? Your family? Your inheritance? The life you were born to?" "Everything," Thomas said without hesitation. "For you, I would give up everything. I would give up my name, my fortune, my place in society. I would give up my library, my books, my entire world, because none of it matters without you. None of it has ever mattered, not really. I've been sleepwalking through my life, going through the motions of being Thomas Ashford, respectable gentleman, dutiful husband, man of property and standing. But I've never been alive until I met you." There was a long silence that stretched out like taffy, elastic and seemingly endless. Margaret watched as Elias looked down at the papers in his hands, his face unreadable in the candlelight, his entire body trembling with emotion. "I can't let you do this," he said finally, and his voice was thick with tears. Thomas's face fell, the hope draining from his expression like water from a broken vessel. "What?" "I can't let you do this," Elias repeated, more firmly now, though his voice was breaking. "Don't you understand what you're saying? You're talking about throwing away your entire life, your inheritance, your name, your place in society, the respect of everyone you know. And for what? For a man who is legally nothing. For a relationship that the world will never accept, that could see us both hanged if we're discovered?" "I don't care what the world accepts," Thomas said, and he moved toward Elias, reaching out as if to touch him. "I care about you. That's the only thing that matters to me anymore." "But I care about you," Elias said, and his voice broke completely now, tears streaming down his face in the candlelight. "I care about you enough to know that you would regret this. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years. But eventually you would resent me. You would lie awake at night thinking about the life you gave up, the family you abandoned, the future you threw away. You would look at me and see only the cause of your ruin." "You're wrong," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Margaret could hear the doubt creeping in at the edges of his certainty. "I'm not wrong," Elias said. "I know you, Thomas. I know you better than anyone. I know how you move through the world, how you think, what drives you. And I know that you're a man who needs his place in the world. You need your library, your books, your position, the respect of your peers. Without those things, you would wither. You would become someone I don't recognize, someone who resents me for the sacrifice you made. And I couldn't bear to watch that happen. I couldn't bear to be the cause of it." Thomas reached out and took Elias's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that streamed down the younger man's cheeks. "Then what do we do? How do we live with this? How do we continue pretending that this means nothing, that we mean nothing to each other?" "I don't know," Elias said, and his voice was hollow now, defeated. "I don't know. I've been asking myself that question every day since you hired me. Every morning when I wake up in the servants' quarters, every night when I lie awake thinking about you. I don't know how to live with this, but I know I can't let you destroy yourself for me." Margaret watched as they embraced, their bodies fitting together as if they'd been designed for each other, as if the universe had intended them to be together despite all the laws and customs and social structures that said otherwise. She watched as Thomas kissed the top of Elias's head, as he murmured words of comfort and love that she'd never heard him speak to anyone, certainly never to her. And she realized, in that moment of crystalline clarity, that her marriage was over. Not because of infidelity, though that was certainly part of it, but because her husband loved someone else more than he loved her, more than he loved their life together, more than he loved anything else in the world. He loved Elias with a purity of feeling that transcended all the boundaries and limitations that society had erected. The question was what she would do about it. She pulled herself away from the door and moved back down the hallway, retracing her steps through the darkened house with careful, measured movements. When she reached her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and waited, her hands folded in her lap, her mind working through the implications of what she'd witnessed. Thomas came back an hour later, his eyes red from crying, his movements slow and heavy with exhaustion and despair. He moved like a man carrying an enormous weight, like someone whose world had collapsed around him and who was still trying to find solid ground. He didn't notice that Margaret was awake, sitting in the darkness with her candle extinguished. He simply undressed in the shadows, his silhouette moving across the room like a ghost, and slipped back into bed, turning away from her, creating a distance between them that felt absolute and unbridgeable. Margaret lay awake beside him, listening to the sound of his breathing, ragged at first, then gradually evening out as exhaustion claimed him. She listened to the sounds of the house settling around them, the creaks and groans of wood and plaster, the wind outside rattling the windows. She listened to the clock in the hall chiming the hours, 1, 2, 3. And she thought about what she'd witnessed. She thought about the love between those two men, a love so powerful it had driven Thomas to contemplate abandoning everything he'd been born to. She thought about Elias's nobility, his refusal to let Thomas destroy himself, even though it meant condemning both of them to a life of stolen moments and hidden passion. She thought about her own marriage, about the comfortable fiction she'd constructed over 15 years, about the woman she'd been before she discovered the journal. By the time dawn broke through the windows, painting the room in shades of gray and gold, Margaret had made her decision. She would confront him. She would tell him that she knew everything. She would tell him about the journal, about the forged documents, about the midnight meeting in the library. And then she would do something that no respectable wife had ever done. She would give him a choice. Because she'd realized, in those long hours of darkness, that love, real love, the kind that transcended all boundaries and limitations, was too rare to destroy. And if Thomas had found it with Elias, if they had found each other despite all the odds stacked against them, then perhaps she had a responsibility to protect that love, rather than destroy it. But first, she would need to understand what she was protecting, and what the cost of that protection might be. Margaret waited until after breakfast to confront him. She'd watched Thomas move through the morning meal like a man performing a role he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. He'd made polite conversation with the servants, inquired about the state of the household accounts, discussed the weather with the detachment of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere. She'd observed the careful way he avoided her gaze, the slight tremor in his hands when he lifted his coffee cup, the tension in his jaw that suggested he was clenching his teeth so hard she was surprised they didn't crack. He thought she didn't know. He believed he'd successfully hidden this entire secret life from her, that she remained oblivious in the comfortable ignorance he'd constructed for her. The thought was almost laughable. After the servants had cleared the breakfast dishes, after Thomas had risen from the table with the intention of retreating to his study, Margaret spoke. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "In the library. Now." Thomas froze, his hand halfway to the pocket watch he kept in his waistcoat. She saw the color drain from his face, saw the calculation flicker across his features as he tried to determine what she knew and how much danger he was in. "The library," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is something amiss?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Something is very much amiss, and we're going to discuss it in private." She didn't wait for him to respond. She simply rose from the table and walked toward the hallway, knowing that he would follow. She could feel his eyes on her back, feel the weight of his confusion and fear pressing against her like a physical force. The library was exactly as it had been the night before. The books arranged in their careful rows, the desk positioned near the window where the morning light streamed in. Margaret moved to the desk and withdrew the journal from where she'd hidden it, behind the volumes on natural philosophy, in a space that Thomas would never think to look because it was too obvious, too close to where he'd stored it originally. She placed it on the desk between them. Thomas's face went white. For a moment, she thought he might actually faint. He reached out as if to grab the journal, then stopped himself, his hand dropping to his side. "Where did you find that?" he asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" Margaret replied. "I found it. I read it. I know everything, Thomas. I know about Elias. I know about the forged documents. I know about your plan to run away together." Thomas sank into the chair behind the desk, his entire body seeming to collapse in on itself. "My God," he said. "My God, Margaret, Don't," she said, holding up a hand. "Don't apologize. Don't make excuses. Don't try to explain it away. I don't want to hear any of that. What I want is the truth. I want you to tell me everything, and I want you to tell me now. while we're alone." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to lie warring with the relief of finally being able to speak openly about something he'd been carrying in secret. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "Since yesterday morning," Margaret said. "I found the journal in the library. I read it. I also heard you and Elias talking last night." "You were listening." There was something almost accusatory in his tone, as if her eavesdropping was somehow worse than his infidelity. "Yes," Margaret said coldly. "I was listening, and I heard everything. The forged documents, the plan to run away, Elias's refusal to let you throw your life away, all of it." Thomas stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He stood there for a long time without speaking, looking out at the garden where, Margaret now realized, he and Elias must have spent countless hours together. "I love him," Thomas said finally, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. "I know that's impossible. I know it's wrong by every standard of society and law and decency, but I love him, Margaret. I love him more than I've ever loved anything or anyone in my entire life." "I know," Margaret said. "I read the journal. I heard you say it last night. I'm not here to judge you, Thomas. I'm here because we need to decide what happens next." Thomas turned to face her, and she was shocked by the anguish in his expression. "What do you mean? What happens next? You're going to tell people, aren't you? You're going to expose this, and Elias he'll be punished. He could be killed." "Is that what you think of me?" Margaret asked, and she was surprised by the hurt in her own voice. "That I would destroy a man simply because my husband loves him?" "I don't know what to think," Thomas said. "I don't know what you want from me, Margaret. I don't know why you're here, why you haven't already called the authorities, why you haven't already—" "Because I'm not a monster," Margaret said sharply. "And because I've been thinking about this all night, and I've come to realize something. That whatever is between you and Elias, it's real. It's more real than anything I've ever seen, and I'm not going to be the one to destroy it." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "What are you saying?" Margaret took a deep breath. She'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, had thought through every possible response, every way this could go wrong. But now that she was actually saying the words, she found herself uncertain, afraid that she was making a terrible mistake. "I'm saying," she began slowly, "that I want a divorce." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. "A divorce," Thomas repeated, as if the word was foreign to him, as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. "Margaret, that's impossible. A woman can't simply—" "I know what a woman can and cannot do," Margaret said. "I know that divorce is scandalous, that it will destroy my reputation, that I'll be cast out of society and probably end up living in some cottage in the countryside as a pariah. But I also know that staying in this marriage is destroying all three of us. You're miserable. Elias is miserable. And I'm miserable, standing here watching my husband love someone else while pretending everything is fine." "You would do that?" Thomas asked. "You would sacrifice your position, your reputation, everything, just to—" "Just to what?" Margaret asked. "Just to give you the chance to be happy?" "Yes, Thomas, I would do that, because I've realized something in the last 24 hours. I've realized that I don't love you. I never really loved you. I married you because it was expected, because you were suitable, because it was the right thing to do. But I've never felt for you what you feel for Elias, and I don't think you've ever felt that way about me either." Thomas sank back into his chair. "This is madness," he said. "Margaret, you're not thinking clearly. You're in shock. You need time to—" "I've had all night to think about it," Margaret said, "and I'm thinking very clearly indeed. Here's what I propose. You divorce me. You claim infidelity on my part. You can say I was involved with the stable master, or one of the footmen, or anyone you like. It will be humiliating for me, but it will free you from the marriage with minimal scandal. Once the divorce is finalized, you're free to do whatever you want. You can stay here if you want, or you can leave, but you'll be free. "And what about Elias?" Thomas asked. "That's up to you," Margaret said. "But I would suggest that you help him escape. Use those forged documents. Give him money. Send him north where he can start a new life as a free man. And then, if you choose to follow him, if you choose to build a life with him somewhere far away from here, then at least you'll both be alive and free." Thomas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Why would you help us?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Why would she? Because she was angry at him. Because she wanted revenge. Because she was noble and selfless and wanted to help true love triumph? "Because," she said finally, "I've spent the last 15 years being a dutiful wife, doing what was expected of me, following the rules, and I've realized that it's gotten me nowhere. I'm 38 years old, Margaret Ashford, and I have nothing to show for my life except a marriage to a man who loves someone else, so I'm going to do something radical. I'm going to do what I want for once. And what I want is to be free of this pretense. I want to start over. I want a life that's actually mine." "You'll be ruined," Thomas said quietly. "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, "but at least I'll be honest. At least I won't be living a lie." Thomas stood up and walked to the window again, and Margaret could see his shoulders shaking slightly. For a moment she thought he was crying, but when he turned back to her, his face was composed, though his eyes were wet. "I don't deserve your kindness," he said. "No," Margaret agreed. "You don't. But you're going to accept it anyway, because it's the only way out of this that doesn't end in tragedy." "And what about you?" Thomas asked. "What will you do?" Margaret smiled slightly. "I have no idea," she said. "That's rather the point, isn't it? For the first time in my life I have no idea what comes next, and I find that rather exhilarating." The lawyer Thomas hired was a thin, nervous man named Mr. Pemberton, with wire-rimmed spectacles and fingers perpetually stained with ink. He arrived at the house on a gray Tuesday afternoon, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents that would, theoretically, unravel 15 years of marriage in a matter of weeks. Margaret received him in the parlor, dressed in her finest day dress, a deep emerald silk that she'd never worn before, purchased specifically for this occasion. She wanted to look composed, authoritative, like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, rather than a woman who was essentially burning her entire life to the ground. "Mrs. Ashford," Mr. Pemberton said, his voice uncertain, "I must say, I find this situation rather unusual. Your husband has instructed me to facilitate a divorce on grounds of your infidelity, but you seem remarkably composed about the matter." "I am not here to discuss my emotional state, Mr. Pemberton," Margaret said coolly. "I am here to ensure that the proceedings move as quickly and discreetly as possible. My husband has made his wishes clear, and I have no desire to contest them." "Yes, well," Mr. Pemberton said, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "The matter of infidelity will require witnesses, of course, and there will be questions about the identity of the gentleman in question." "I'm sure you can be creative," Margaret said. "Surely a man in your profession has handled such matters before." Mr. Pemberton's face flushed slightly. "I understand that discretion is important here, Mrs. Ashford, but I must warn you that this will be a scandal. The dissolution of a marriage on grounds of infidelity is not something that can be kept entirely quiet. There will be talk." "There will indeed be talk," Margaret agreed, "but that is a price I'm willing to pay." Over the next week, Margaret watched as the machinery of dissolution began to grind into motion. Thomas signed documents. Mr. Pemberton made discreet inquiries. Money changed hands. Margaret tried not to think about how much of her husband's fortune was being spent to free him from her. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. She'd begun to notice things she'd never paid attention to before. The way the light fell through the library windows in the late afternoon. The particular scent of the roses in the garden. A delicate, almost heartbreaking fragrance. The sound of the servants moving through the house, their footsteps on the wooden floors, their quiet conversations in the kitchen. She was beginning to see her own life with new clarity, and what she saw was both beautiful and terrifying. One afternoon, she found herself in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree. This was where Thomas and Elias had met, she realized. She could almost see them here, Thomas in his dark coat, Elias in the simple clothes of a servant, their hands finding each other in the shadows of the leaves. "Mrs. Ashford?" Margaret turned to find Elias standing a few feet away, his face uncertain, his body tense. She'd never spoken to him directly before, had only glimpsed him in passing around the house or heard his voice through the library door. "Yes," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Please, sit down. We should talk." Elias hesitated, then sat on the far end of the bench, maintaining a careful distance between them. Up close, Margaret could see why Thomas had fallen in love with him. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a quiet dignity in the way he held himself, a beauty that transcended the merely physical. "I wanted to apologize," Elias said quietly, "for what I've done, for what Thomas and I have done. I know that." "You have nothing to apologize for," Margaret interrupted. "You didn't seduce my husband, Elias. If anything, he seduced you, and, more importantly, you were honest with him when he wanted to throw his life away. You showed more integrity in that moment than most people show in their entire lives." Elias looked at her with confusion. "I don't understand. Why are you being kind to me? Why are you helping us?" Margaret considered the question. "Because," she said finally, "I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me. I married the right man, maintained the right household, played the right role. And in doing all of that, I forgot to actually live. I forgot to ask myself what I wanted, what would make me happy. You and Thomas have reminded me of something important, that life is too short to waste on pretense and obligation." "But your reputation," Elias said, "your position in society, you're throwing all of that away." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "I am, but I'm beginning to think that position and reputation are rather hollow things if they come at the cost of one's soul." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the light filter through the leaves of the oak tree, creating patterns of shadow and gold on the ground. "What will you do?" Elias asked finally. "After the divorce?" "I haven't the faintest idea," Margaret said, and she found herself smiling. "Isn't that marvelous? For the first time in my life, I have absolutely no idea what comes next." "You could come with us," Elias said suddenly. "Thomas and we're planning to go north, to Boston, perhaps, or Philadelphia. You could come with us. You could start over, away from all of this." Margaret was touched by the offer, genuinely moved by his kindness, but she shook her head. "No," she said. "That's your story, not mine. I need to write my own story now, and I don't think that story includes following my ex-husband and his lover to a new life. I think my story is about discovering who Margaret Ashford actually is, beneath all the layers of expectation and duty." "I hope you find what you're looking for," Elias said. "So do I," Margaret replied. The divorce was finalized on a cold December morning. Margaret sat in the courthouse listening as the judge read the particulars of her infidelity with a tone of barely concealed disapproval. She'd expected to feel shame, but instead she felt only a strange sense of liberation, as if chains she'd been wearing her entire life were finally being removed. Thomas was not present. He'd decided it was better to remain absent, to avoid the spectacle entirely. But Margaret knew he was waiting for her outside, waiting to say goodbye before he and Elias disappeared into the north. When she emerged from the courthouse, she found him standing by a carriage, his face drawn and exhausted. Beside him stood Elias, dressed in traveling clothes, his forged documents tucked safely in his coat pocket. "Margaret," Thomas said, approaching her, "I wanted to thank you for everything, for understanding, for giving us this chance." "I hope you're happy," Margaret said simply. "Both of you. I hope you build a life together that's worth everything you've sacrificed." "I hope you find happiness, too," Thomas said. "I know I haven't been a good husband to you. I know I've been selfish and cruel in my own way, but I do wish you well." Margaret nodded, accepting his words without comment. She had no desire to rehash the failures of their marriage, no need to assign blame or seek apologies. That chapter of her life was closed now. Elias stepped forward and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your kindness, for your courage." Margaret shook his hand, noting the warmth of his grip, the genuine gratitude in his eyes. "Take care of him," she said. "He's fragile in ways he doesn't understand." "I will," Elias promised. She watched as they climbed into the carriage as the driver snapped the reins and the horses began to move, carrying them away from the courthouse, away from the life they'd known, away into whatever future awaited them in the north. And then she turned and walked in the opposite direction, her head held high, her heart beating with a rhythm that felt entirely new. She had no home to return to. Thomas had generously allowed her to remain in the house for another month while she made arrangements. But she had no intention of staying. She had no clear plan for what came next. She had no idea where she would go, or what she would do, or who she would become. But for the first time in her life, the absence of a plan felt like freedom rather than terror.